Good morning, everyone. We're here with Mr. Philip Hardwick. He's the business manager, right, for the Hardwick Climate Business Limited. Thank you, Mr. Hardwick, for being here. It's a pleasure to have you with us. And welcome to Uniremington University.
Thank you very much to Uniremington for inviting us today to give one of your lectures. Today we're going to talk about carbon markets and carbon offsets. The reason we're going to do that is a very hot topic in the world right now, and a lot of people are asking to hear more about this subject. So today we're going to give you an opportunity to hear from us. We are practitioners in carbon markets for a very long time, since the beginning of the real commercial use of carbon markets, the beginning of the European Union emission trading scheme. We've been active in emissions trading and carbon markets and green finance. Our company is from the financial sector. We have a background in investment banking. We have a background in environmental economics. And as such, we do two major things. We do a lot of advisory work, a lot of policy work, and we do a lot of commercial development work on carbon offset schemes. So from this first slide, you can see that we advise countries in Latin America, Chile, in fact, Colombia. We've been advisors to the European Union and to Korea on all factors relating to carbon markets. That's on the policy side. We also work with universities. We're working with you guys today, which is a tremendous honor. We've worked with Universidad de Chile in Santiago. We've worked with the University of Zaragoza in Spain, and with University in Cape Town. We have, aside from our policy and our academic connections, a great commercial connection, given that we work with financiers who are looking to develop nature-based solutions and carbon offset projects and green finance globally. We work at the corporate level, and we hope to play an important role in the energy transition and the net zero targets that we all have by helping facilitate the bridge between environmental outcomes and corporate need and corporate operation. So today we're going to give you guys an opportunity to hear a bit about carbon offsets, which is one major aspect of green finance, and hopefully it will give you a bit of background to the history, to the theory, and to what's going on in Colombia at the moment and what the opportunities for Colombia are as well. But we'll start from a very basic principle of cap and trade. I know that some of the business students at Remington will understand a little bit about what this means, but this is about pricing pollution, effectively pricing carbon and forcing economic decisions that have positive externalities. So cap and trade is a mechanism for rewarding positive action and invention, and it does that by saying, okay, we do not want any more than a certain limit of greenhouse gases emitted into our environment, and at the policy level we determine what that level is, and we set that cap, and then we say to the affected industries underneath that we have selected, you will not pollute above your share of that cap. But if at the end of the year, when you are monitored and it is apparent that you have polluted above that cap, you will have to pay for the right for that pollution. And we do that by allocating you at the beginning of the year an amount of certificates that enable you a certain level of pollution. But if you go above that, as you can see from the blue factory image on the slide, you're going to have to purchase those to get back beneath the dotted line, about beneath the cap of which you can pollute. However, it may be that another industry player has managed to reduce their emissions by positive actions, investing in greater technology or making more environmentally conscious processing decisions. And they have actually at the end of the year polluted less than the cap required. And so they have an excess of allocated certificates, which they could potentially sell to the entities that have over polluted. And in that sense, we have created a market. And to that sense, we've put a price on carbon and a price on emissions. And what we've done is we've created a price at which positive action occurs, a price at which behaviour changes. And so across the economy, we can say that if we were to look at this at a very macro level, what price would we require to put onto industry to switch from one behaviour, a negative behaviour, a polluting behaviour, to a positive behaviour? And the positive behaviour in this case would be the investment away from fossil fuels and into more renewable energies, or moving away from fossil fuel vehicles into electric vehicles. And this graph here, which is provided by Goldman Sachs, shows the sectors and the cost associated with the switching required away from certain activities. So on the very left-hand side there, where you have a negative amount, this is actually sectors where it actually pays to make the change in your behaviour already. This could be something like electric light bulb, LED light bulbs, or moving away from incandescent light bulbs, which we've all been doing over the last 20 years. It could be that the bigger switches are too much for us at the moment. If you look at the very right-hand side, we're talking about serious cost of abatement, and this could be something like carbon capture and storage, which, whilst we know we would like to do it, is incredibly expensive. And if we look at that same opportunity and cost in a different graph, this time provided by McKinsey, this goes into a bit more granular detail about where the switching point is for each of these technologies. And so if you were to look in the very middle of the graph, say here where it's 0, around about 15, 18 gigatons per year, you can see that actually this is the agricultural sector. So it's a very low cost of switching. But moving back to the left here in these negative prices, and as I said in the previous graph, lighting, it actually pays to make the switch away from current incandescent lighting to LED lighting. And there's a range of technologies here that are actually paying right now to switch from existing technologies. Again, as it starts to get more expensive, nuclear fuel, restoring degraded land, which we'll talk a lot about a bit later, and right up into the coal retrofitting and building new efficient carbon capture and storage in the iron and steel industry. These are very expensive technologies, and the price of carbon where it is today does not incentivize that switching. This concept has been around for a good 25 years more. In fact, the earliest proponent of approaching cap and trade at scale was not the European Union trading scheme, but in fact the North American acid rain program, which was incredibly effective. And for those of us old enough to remember, acid rain was a very big news item for many years, but SO2 trading in the United States effectively brought acid rain under control, and so it's proven to be effective economic mechanism. And the EU ETS, the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, has been in existence for broadly 15 years, and it's had some highs and lows. It is a marketplace, and in its initial sense, in its initial years, it didn't allocate the permits, the right to pollute particularly efficiently, so that some people had far too many rights to pollute. If you go back to the earlier graph, in the initial allocation of the EU ETS, this yellow factory on the left had far too much. This yellow was going right down to the floor almost, and so there was a massive over allocation of supply, and that forced a big price fall. We then had in 2008, 2009, a reduction in economic activity caused by the global financial crisis. So we had the oversupply that suppressed the price in the early years. Fortunately, after the initial phase, that oversupply was taken away, but then we went straight into a period of economic downturn, and we saw that the price of emissions stayed very low for quite a long time. We also saw industries being very effective in their lobbying to the European Union. The airline industry managed to lobby to get 80% of their carbon credits for free, making it fairly ineffectual. And we have seen that kind of political pressure in other schemes around the world. We then saw in the mid-teens, the European Union really wake up to the fact that this market needed some sort of intervention. And in the same way that a central bank operates in currency markets and interest rate markets, the European Union very much intervened with the Market Stability Reserve, removing credits in circulation. And that sentiment and that policy change has had a positive impact on price. There is always a moral sentiment element to environmental markets. And alongside those good policy measures in European Union, we've seen a lot of corporates, a lot of governments, almost on a daily basis are now announcing stronger targets, net zero targets, which has all had a very positive impact on the carbon price. So if we just take the EU ETS in isolation, we can see that during its early years of design and trial and error, there has been a large oversupply due to poor allocation, the impact of the financial crisis, getting to a point in the mid-teens of 2013, 2015, when reforms and policies start to push the price back up. We will always have shocks like Brexit and uncertainty, but more recently, and one of the reasons there's a large call to have lectures like this and learning like this is that the price of emissions has risen dramatically, and that has had an impact not only in the European Union, as you can see on that price graph there. It's well up at €30 per metric ton now, but it's also had an impact on international carbon markets, of which there are a growing amount. And carbon markets aren't always at the continental level. Sometimes they're at the supranational level, of course, but they can be at the country level. There are carbon markets in China and New Zealand and Korea, and in the USA there are carbon markets and emissions trading schemes that are at the state level. California, the Western Climate Initiative of California is linked also with the Canadian Quebec scheme. And at an even more granular level than that, there are city-based schemes, and most city-based schemes are, as you can see from that list there, are in Asia, but there's a lot of Chinese city-based schemes and Japanese schemes. And what it means is that the map of carbon markets around the world is growing and is positive. And if you look at where the carbon markets actually are, they are in the areas of the highest economic activity for the world, the East Coast, West Coast of the United States, Europe, and Asia and Southeast Asia. And this is a very good thing. This means that we are learning how to operate these markets more efficiently. And the markets are talking to each other and trying to link, and there are some linkages, very tentative at this stage, but the Swiss market is now linked into the European Union scheme as of 2020. Of course, because of Brexit, the UK has left the EU ETS, but it intends to link back to the EU ETS at some point. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also linkage between geographies as far apart as California and Quebec. Now, in terms of Latin America, as you guys are aware, the Alianza Pacifica comes around Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, and that is an obvious linkage. The tax scheme in Colombia is very similar to the tax scheme in Chile for the price of carbon and the types of offsets that can be used. And so globally, we see policy not saying let's just have a carbon market, but let's have a carbon market that links potentially with our neighbours. And that is obviously a very positive development, as this is very much a global concern. And to just look at the growth of carbon markets in a slightly easier format, you can see that since 2005 and the EU ETS, which is broadly speaking 16 years till today, there are 3 times as many greenhouse gas emissions that are underneath some sort of emissions trading scheme. And this is, of course, very much reflected in the amount of media and news that we see today, that this issue has been steadily increasing in presence and action over the years, and is in a position now where some might say we're at a tipping point of this becoming fully mainstream. So what I've spoken about so far is emissions trading schemes, where there is a government scheme that says there is a cap and you cannot pollute above this cap, and if you do, you need to either pay a fine or you need to buy certificates that have previously been allocated. But what about the subject that many of you will have heard of, carbon offsetting? How does that fit in? Well, a carbon offset is a mechanism that uses capital from one area of the world or from a private source to invest in mitigating actions in return for a certificate to prove your mitigating action, and that certificate either has value in a compliance scheme like we've just discussed, a regulated EU ETS, it can be switched for an allowance, or it has a value because it enables you to qualify your intention and your action to create positive outcomes alongside your current economic activity that enable you to say, we are reducing emissions. We're not necessarily reducing emissions just inside of our own company, but we're also investing in schemes and opportunities outside of our own operations and reducing emissions elsewhere. And the carbon offset is a way of proving that you have invested in and acted to produce a positive outcome. This market, again, has been around for a very long time, probably the best part of 25 years. And during that time, the types of project that we have invested in have very much changed. 10, 15 years ago, of course, renewables were not so prevalent as they are today. There were a lot of carbon offset schemes in renewables, in industrial gases, and that was great because it stimulated a lot of investment in those schemes around the world. They also created some very pioneering and very socially positive outcomes, such as clean cook stoves, which reduce the carbon and particulate matter that is a huge medical problem for most of the world, and also a carbon polluting problem. And today, the methodologies and the way of calculating carbon offsets is now at a point of sophistication where we can calculate nature-based solutions. We can plant trees, reforest trees, protect lands, protect mangroves, look at soil sequestration as methods of carbon sequestration, and have those as schemes as well. And the big evolution in carbon offsets in the last 10 years is that they've moved very much from moving from one behaviour to a less bad behaviour, maybe energy efficiency or switching from coal to gas. But now, in this time here today, the carbon offset that people want is the one that actually physically sequesters CO2 from the environment. So we're not just making a less bad action, but we're having an absolutely positive action of taking CO2 out of the environment, and it's a big market. There are on the right hand side there, you can see some very famous global names that buy these carbon offsets as part of their net zero strategy. They're also purchased by governments, and thousands of other companies that are not on this list. You require a specialist market to help develop, market and finance these projects, and those guys in this diagram are in the red box, the broker box there, are the facilitators of these transactions, and they work alongside many development companies that are on the ground making these projects happen. Now, this marketplace is all overseen by some very well established carbon verification bodies, Gold Standard, Verra, and there are now thousands of projects listed on these registries, and are having a huge impact on the number of global greenhouse gases that are effectively reduced by the projects under their mechanisms. As I said, today the most popular type of carbon offset is the nature-based solution, the one which sequesters carbon from the environment, and of course not only takes the carbon out of the environment but also replaces the natural habitat. Nobody needs to be told that reducing the area of wetland, peatland, mangrove, rainforest, or stripping back areas such that they become desertified, desertification occurs, is a good thing. You know, we all know that we need to address these negative aspects of human behaviour from the last centuries, and nature-based solutions are carbon offset projects that try to do that, and they attract the money from the corporate sector, from the government sector, to invest in huge replanting opportunities or nature protection opportunities. But alongside that, they of course provide social benefits, human benefits such as employment, education, sanitation, and so this is very much an opportunity, of course, for Colombia, given its unique geography and biodiverse opportunity to help in the nature-based solutions aspect of carbon markets that is currently very much popular. If we look at just forestry projects, we can see that they very much, this in the World Bank report, the State of the Carbon Markets, you can see that forestry now leads the way in the volume of CO2 that's offset, overtaking renewables. And 10 years ago that was not the case. 10 years ago, forestry projects were somewhat hamstrung by the methodology and the assumptions they made about land rights being cast forward for a number of years. But clever methodology, evolution and persistence from developers and registries and Verra have pioneering the way, have made the methodologies for reforestation now very attractive and investable, and so much so that whilst a lot of forestry projects are still about protecting existing rainforest, there is an increasing amount of offset projects that are to do with reforestation and afforestation, which is about putting back trees where they have been deforested, or new forestry could be planted on degraded land. Our business works in this field. We are developers of, financiers of, advisors to carbon projects in the nature-based solutions area. And these projects are about finding the right land and the right people, the right forestry companies, the right individuals, the right owners of the land to undertake a replantation scheme, to go through with due diligence the process for validating, mapping out the project plan, and monitoring and physically planting the trees such that they are meeting the exacting standards of the carbon offset scheme that they are under, and are therefore producing a certificate, an item of value that can be sold onto the market. And of course, the end result is the positive externality, which is that we're left with the trees. And that is the main thing that we should never lose sight of. The carbon offset market is about incentivizing corporate and human behavior to plant trees and to reduce CO2. And the net result of this is that trees are planted at the end of these projects and are left there. So of course, this brings us into the eternal question of how do you finance that? It's all very well and good saying you're going to find the land, you're going to plant the trees, and you're going to leave them there. But who's actually going to pay for the initial planting, the initial forestry, the intellectual capability and property to develop the carbon project? Well, that's where this bridge between the corporate world and the environmental needs of Earth come together, such that there are now fairly well tried and tested mechanisms for financing carbon projects, which are not for today's lecture. But needless to say, there is a long time lag, of course, between the production of the money to do the project and the carbon offsets at the end of it. But with careful management and experience, the project can be designed in tandem with not only the carbon offset, but also sustainable forestry and other commercial aspects, such that the financing can provide revenues throughout the life of the project, and still have the main objective of leaving a land bank of trees at the end of the project's life. So if we come to Colombia, we can, as we mentioned earlier, Colombia has a national carbon tax, very similar to that in other parts of Latin America, Chile. And of course, we know that rather than pay that tax, a Colombian company can submit carbon offset projects against their tax liability. But that's clearly not the only opportunity for Colombia. It's not just the regulated market that is of use here for Colombia. It has such an opportunity in reforestation that it can be exporting carbon credits to the rest of the world to help corporates meet their net zero targets, to help governments meet their objectives. And so we expect that if you look at that that donut graph down there on the bottom left, which shows the number of projects registered, We expect that to be growing over the coming years in Colombia, as it not only produces more projects for its internal emissions trading scheme and potential linkages to other areas of Latin America, but also produces emissions reductions that are exported and become an export industry for Colombia. If we look at the type of project that is currently in Colombia, of course, a lot of it is a nature-based solution already. As we said, Colombia is a uniquely biodiverse and forested land with amazing agricultural capabilities, but the current projects that are in Colombia are mainly about protecting the existing rainforest, and that is great, and it is of course very important, and we call these projects RED projects, but this is not where you're planting back trees. You can see that the smaller slice of the donut on the left there shows the amount of projects that are effectively about afforestation, which is planting on new land, or reforestation, which is replacing existing forests. And we expect that share to grow as Colombia realizes the opportunity it has to reforest its existing lands, because the carbon market produces a price for this replacement. There are amazing projects that are RED projects, which is protecting land, but of course, you know, this is land protection. It's not new sequestration other than the existing growth of those forests. So the ability to sequester more carbon is really the opportunity that afforestation and reforestation projects present. But look at the graph on the right. You can see that the carbon tax of Colombia was implemented at the end of 2016. You can see that projects are now growing, and that's, broadly speaking, the domestic demand. Of course, as we see the international demand for offsets increasing, we can expect the VCU issuances for Colombia to steadily increase, and that's obviously a positive aspect for not only the Colombian environment, but also the Colombian economy. Of course, if something becomes big news like carbon offsets, there has to be a reason for that, and of course policy is never far behind public sentiment. And so what is driving this from a policy side? We've discussed that companies want to say that they're net zero. We've discussed that governments want to say that they're net zero, and that's creating a large demand for offsets as one of the mechanisms for reaching net zero. But under international negotiation, we have the Paris Agreement, and in the Paris Agreement it makes Article 6 clear, which is a mechanism for using the marketplace to drive economic behaviour and environmental outcomes. And we expect that the final negotiations of Article 6, which consider internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, will be completed relatively soon, perhaps even as soon as the COP in the UK, COP26. And what we have here is a lot of market watching by policy makers on a country level, but also environmental market analysts who are looking at the current debate in the international negotiations known as the Conference of Parties, and thinking that very soon, given the sentiment of the net zero movement, the race to zero, that we will have some clear international agreement on what policies are to be implemented that enable the marketplace to be used to drive positive externalities from economic behaviour. And what that means is we're expecting there to be law soon that further promotes the use of market mechanisms for producing positive environmental impacts. And it's likely perhaps that carbon markets would be one of those market mechanisms under consideration. They've been around for 25 years. Carbon offsets have been around for a very long time also. So surely we would use our international agreements to help solidify and internationalize the use of those market mechanisms. We also have new policy organizations that are feeding into political thinking, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which advises into the G20 group of nations, is looking very much at what regulation is needed in financial markets and in the firm to produce positive behaviour. One of those would be potentially board responsibility for climate change. To make a listed company have to have somebody on its board who has a responsibility for climate change. That's a big move. That moves climate responsibility one step closer to fiduciary responsibility, and that can only be seen as a positive action if you are in favour of policy enhancing environmental action. So HCBL, of course, watches these developments very closely, and from time to time helps with the implementation of policy related to these discussions and these debates. But for today, we won't go into too much detail because we are, of course, treating this as an introduction to carbon markets. But we very much welcome any questions that you students may have, and we will take those from here. Thank you very much.